I had exactly $418,200 left that I could touch without selling the house, and I knew the number because I had calculated it twice from a hospital bed while a heart monitor clicked beside me like an impatient metronome. 21 hours earlier, I had still been president of Hartwell Biologics, a Chicago medical device company I had helped build from 3 leased rooms near the river into a publicly traded business worth just under $2 billion. Then, my own board suspended me during cardiac observation, blamed me for a confidential leak I did not commit, and moved to close a $96 million licensing agreement through a shell arrangement I had never authorized. The nurse had just adjusted my IV when a courier arrived with a black envelope and a silver USB card no one could explain. By the time I understood what was inside, I knew 2 things. They intended to ruin me while I was sedated and contained, and if I handled it correctly, the same documents would put them in front of a judge before the week was over. Let me take you back. The week began with the kind of exhaustion that hides inside routine. Chicago in late October has a way of flattening color. The lake goes iron gray. The sidewalks shine as if the whole city has been wiped down with cold water. I had been living on airport coffee, antacids, and 4-hour nights for months because we were in the final stretch of a licensing partnership with a Japanese manufacturer named Aizawa Medical Systems. It was not a merger. It was more delicate than that. We had developed a wound closure polymer that could cut recovery time after orthopedic surgery, and Aizawa wanted exclusive manufacturing rights across Asia. The licensing fee alone was $96 million, with milestone payments behind it that would have stabilized Hartwell for years. I had negotiated the whole thing the old-fashioned way: dinners without photographers, site visits no one posted about, long conversations with engineers, not just executives. Our counterpart, Kenji Aizawa, cared about employment stability and product quality more than glossy forecasts, which was one of the reasons I liked him. He reminded me of the company's founder, Richard Hartwell, who used to say that a clean balance sheet meant nothing if the people making the product were afraid to go home and open their mail. By then, Richard had been dead for almost 3 years, and his widow, Margaret, had withdrawn from daily operations. The board chair had become Lorraine Holloway, a donor-heavy social operator whose real talent was sitting in rooms she did not understand and making everyone there feel provisional. Her son, Evan Holloway, became chief executive at 34. He had good hair, a graduate degree from exactly the kind of school people mention too casually, and a habit of calling operational competence legacy drag. He did not like me because I was old enough to remember the company before consultants started translating plain greed into cleaner vocabulary. The first time he tried to diminish me in front of the board, he tapped the table with one manicured fingernail and said, "Daniel is excellent at stewarding the past. I'm focused on building the future." I remember folding my glasses and setting them down. "The future," I said, "usually works better when it can survive an audit." A few people smiled without showing teeth. Evan did not. He preferred younger executives with softer spines. Nina Cates, our CFO, was brilliant, precise, and ambitious enough to sand herself smooth around power. She had once told me that governance was mostly theater and that the audience only cared who looked confident under the lights. I should have heard the warning in that. The dehumanization came in smaller moments before it came in the large one. At a strategy retreat in Lake Geneva, I walked into a side room and heard Evan say to a consultant, "He's not a threat. He's institutional memory in a suit." He did not know I was behind him, or maybe he did. A month later, when I objected to an aggressive restructuring plan for our Cleveland plant, Lorraine leaned back in her chair and said almost gently, "Daniel, no one doubts your loyalty, but loyalty can become a form of nostalgia, and nostalgia is expensive." That was the tone of it. Calm cruelty, never loud enough to quote cleanly afterward. My realistic flaw, if you want one, was that I thought being indispensable would protect me. I kept immaculate records, avoided gossip, and believed that if my work was better than theirs, then eventually the facts would do what facts are supposed to do. That is not how power works inside a frightened boardroom. Facts matter, but timing matters more, and narrative matters most of all. On Tuesday morning, I was in our West Loop office reviewing final comments from Aizawa's counsel, when I felt the first tightness in my chest. Not pain exactly. More like someone had cinched a strap beneath my sternum and pulled once, sharply, to remind me I was still made of tissue and electricity, and not just deadlines. I ignored it for 3 hours because that is what men in my position often do when they have confused endurance with character. By afternoon, my assistant Mara had taken one look at me and said, "You're gray." "I'm 54, I told her. "No," she said, "you're gray." An hour later, I was in Northwestern Memorial under observation for what the doctor called an arrhythmia likely aggravated by stress and dehydration. They kept using the reassuring vocabulary hospitals use when they are not yet sure whether to scare you. Manageable. Precautionary. Monitoring. My daughter Lucy called from Ann Arbor and told me, with the same steady voice her mother used to have, that if I tried to review contracts from a hospital bed, she would drive down and throw my laptop into Lake Michigan herself. I promised to rest. Then I asked the nurse for my phone charger. At 7:12 p.m., while I still had adhesive patches on my chest, I got the email. Administrative leave pending internal review. Access suspended effective immediately. Contact outside counsel only through designated channels. There was no phone call, no board discussion, no courtesy from anyone who had shaken my hand that morning. 5 minutes later, my corporate email locked. Then, Slack. Then, the virtual data room I had been using for the Aizawa transaction, or so I thought. At 7:31 p.m., the courier arrived with the black envelope. Inside was a separation agreement, a proxy supplement scheduling an emergency board action for the next afternoon, and a silver USB card with no label. The agreement accused me of breaching fiduciary duty by leaking confidential pricing information to outside parties. My unvested equity was to be canceled for cause. That mattered more than the title. My stock and deferred compensation were the difference between security and slow panic. The equity piece alone was worth just over $11 million if the quarter closed as forecast. They were not just firing me. They were amputating the future I had counted on after the divorce, after tuition, after the years of saying yes to things I should have said no to. Tucked behind the agreement was a handwritten note from Mara in tight block letters. "Don't call the office. Check the USB offline." I waited until the nurse left and opened my personal laptop. The USB contained 2 folders. One was labeled Board Packet. The other was labeled Old Drafts. The first folder held board minutes describing me as unstable, obstructive, and potentially impaired in recent negotiations. There were prepared remarks for Evan to use at Thursday night's Hartwell Foundation Donor Gala, where he planned to announce the Aizawa agreement without me. There was also a cap table update showing my shares canceled upon ratification. The second folder changed everything. Inside were 3 PDFs and an export log. The first was a draft of the Aizawa license agreement I had approved the previous Friday. The second was the version prepared for Thursday's gala announcement. The third was a side letter creating an efficiency escrow through a Delaware entity called North Reach Holdings, LLC. On paper, it looked technical. In reality, it diverted $14.8 million of the upfront licensing fee into a separate structure controlled through beneficial ownership by a trust linked to Lorraine Holloway. If you don't spend your life around corporate fraud, beneficial ownership sounds abstract. It simply means the person getting the benefit can hide behind layered paperwork and still control the money. And escrow sounds safe until someone writes the instructions. There, in neat legal language, was the theft. Funds were to be released for strategic integration advisory services that did not exist. The fake vendor had no operating history, no staff, and an address that matched a registered agent service in Wilmington. It was not sloppy. It was designed to survive the first glance and fail the fifth. At 8:06 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was a message from a number I didn't recognize. "Sign tonight and protect your reputation. If you miss this, you lose everything. No signature, no need." I knew it was Evan. I knew. The line sat on my screen while the monitor beside me clicked. There are moments when the body understands danger before the mind arranges it into sentences. Mine did. The gala was tomorrow night. The emergency board vote would give them procedural cover. Once the deal was announced publicly, they would recast me as a disgruntled former executive. If Aizawa signed under false pretenses, untangling it would become harder, slower, and dirtier. They were counting on speed, confusion, and my physical isolation. I called the only person I knew who could think faster than I could when cornered, Celia Boone, an attorney I had met years earlier during a product liability matter. Celia did not do panic. She did structure. Her voice came on low and awake, as if she had been expecting the world to misbehave. "Tell me what happened," she said. I did. I kept it clean. Dates, names, documents, amounts. When I finished, she was quiet for 2 seconds. "Do not sign anything," she said. "Do not forward company materials to anyone except counsel. And do not assume they understand the difference between governance theater and prosecutable conduct." What am I looking at? At minimum, bad faith termination, possible breach of fiduciary duty by the board, disclosure issues, and a very interesting question about fraud if that side letter was concealed from the counterparty. I need the files, not screenshots. Files. I hesitated. "They'll accuse me of theft." "They already have. Send them to me so I can preserve chain of custody and review metadata." Metadata matters because files remember things people forget. Who edited them? When? On what machine? It's the digital equivalent of fingerprints, only less dramatic and more useful. I sent the files. An hour later, Celia called back with someone else on the line, a forensic accountant named Ezra Levin. Ezra sounded like the sort of man who ironed receipts before scanning them. "The export log is promising," he said. "The side letter was generated after the board packet timestamp. If the metadata holds, someone inserted that after supposed approval. Also, your board minutes have version inconsistencies. Whoever assembled this moved too fast." "That helps me how?" "It helps because fraud hates sequence," Celia said. "If we can prove the documents were altered after the board meeting they describe, then their narrative collapses." "Can we stop the gala?" "Maybe, but we do better if we stop the transaction and force a hearing. I want affidavits tonight. An affidavit is just a sworn written statement. People think it sounds grander than it is. What matters is that lying in one has consequences." I looked at the dark hospital window and my own reflection in it. "This isn't going to stay private, is it?" "No," Celia said, "and that may save you." At 10:14 p.m., I got the second surprise. Priya Desai, our assistant general counsel, emailed my personal address from a Proton account. Priya was 31, careful, and so understated that people around her confused discretion with passivity. I had assumed she was keeping her head down to survive Evan. Her message contained 9 words. "I have something you should have seen. Call me from a secure line." When she answered, I could hear traffic and wind. She was outside somewhere. "I don't have long," she said. "I'm parked 3 blocks from my apartment because I think my phone may be monitored." That got my attention. She told me that 2 weeks earlier Lorraine had insisted on distributing personalized board packets for confidentiality reasons. I had designed that system myself years before after a leak involving another acquisition. Each packet contained a canary clause buried in the indemnification language, a harmless variation in wording unique to each recipient. A canary clause does not change the contract. It changes the sentence around it just enough that, if a version leaks, you know whose copy escaped. It is a silent die pack in a stack of paper. "You remember the language in section 14.2? Priya asked. I wrote it. The leaked draft that Nina used as the source for the side letter contains Lorraine's variant. For a moment, I did not speak. Then I sat up too quickly, and the telemetry leads pulled at my skin. It means the confidential draft didn't come from you," she said. "It came from Lorraine's copy, and there's more. Nina had me generate a DocuSign envelope for the board consent at 4:11 p.m. yesterday, but the audit trail shows the side letter was attached after 6:40 p.m., after 2 signatures were already collected. She said it was a formatting fix. It wasn't. This is what people miss about fraud. It is rarely one giant thing. It is a staircase of smaller dishonesties built quickly enough that decent people feel tired just looking at it. "Why are you helping me?" I asked. A beat of silence. Then, "Because Richard Hartwell recruited my father when no one else would. Because this company paid for his chemo." Because Evan referred to me in a meeting last month as the diversity line item with a law degree, and because if this closes, they're going to gut the foundation and call it optimization. There it was, not sentiment, alignment. I put the phone face down for a moment and let the ceiling lights blur. Then I picked it back up and called Celia. By midnight, we had a plan. Celia would file for a temporary restraining order in Cook County Chancery Court before dawn to halt any board action tied to my termination and to block execution of the Aizawa license pending a hearing. A temporary restraining order, or TRO, is exactly what it sounds like. The court hitting pause before someone does something that cannot be cleanly undone. Ezra would prepare a short forensic memorandum on the metadata and the escrow structure. Priya would sign an affidavit under seal about the altered DocuSign process and the canary clause. Mara, bless her, would provide a statement that she had found the black envelope placed on my chair before anyone officially informed me of suspension. That mattered because it showed preparation. They had written the theater before the scene began. At 1:20 a.m., and while a nurse changed my monitor batteries, Celia said, "Daniel, listen to me. This isn't revenge. This is justice." I knew why she said it. Because I was angry enough to make bad decisions. Because men my age, when publicly humiliated, sometimes confuse lawful force with emotional theater. I took a breath and looked at the legal pads on my tray table, full of handwriting that had gotten steadier the more cornered I became. "You're right," I said. "I know." By morning, the hospital released me with strict instructions to rest, hydrate, and not behave like an idiot. I violated at least 2 of those within the hour. Mara picked me up in a navy raincoat and drove me straight to Celia's office in the Loop while it rained in that thin, relentless way Chicago does best. On the ride, she said, "I'm sorry I didn't warn you sooner." "You did. I mean sooner." I looked out at the wet glass towers and the traffic lights reflecting on the street. "You got me what I needed." At Celia's office, Ezra had spread printouts across a conference table with the clinical satisfaction of a man who had found termites in a judge's summer house. He showed me the metadata chain, Nina's laptop ID, export time, revision history, a hotel IP from the Langham where Lorraine had hosted a private donor dinner the night before. The side letter had not existed when the board packet went out. The board minutes had been converted to PDF before the final signature trail completed. In plain English, the paperwork was lying about when it had become true. Around noon, Celia got the call we needed. The judge had granted a short ex parte TRO on the limited record and set a hearing for the following morning. Ex parte means the judge can act initially without both sides in the room when the risk of immediate harm is high. Judges do not love doing it, which was exactly why it mattered. We had crossed the line from suspicion into enough evidence to make a court nervous. But the gala was still on. Hartwell's annual donor gala took place every fall at the Museum of Science and Industry. Richard Hartwell had loved the old place because it treated engineering like culture and not just commerce. That year, a storm rolling in off the lake forced the cocktail reception off the terrace and into the main hall under the suspended aircraft. More donors, more echo, more witnesses. By 6:30 that evening, the room was full of surgeons, foundation trustees, local press, and the sort of corporate benefactors who say mission while checking whether their names are spelled correctly on the easel cards. I wore a dark charcoal suit because black would have looked theatrical and blue would have shown the rain. Celia insisted on that. "You are not a victim entering his own funeral," she said. "You are an executive attending a proceeding that became public by their choice." We did not arrive dramatically. We walked in through the front, checked our coats, and stood near the back while Evan worked the room with one hand on champagne stems he never drank from. Lorraine saw me first. Her smile did not change, but her shoulders did. "Well," she said when she reached us, "this is unexpected." "No," Celia said pleasantly. "This is service." She handed Lorraine the TRO and proof of filing. I watched something precise happen behind Lorraine's eyes, not panic, calculation adjusting itself too late. "You can't possibly think this is the place," she said. "You made it the place," Celia replied. Evan arrived before Lorraine could recover. He had the hard brightness some men mistake for composure. "Daniel," he said, as if greeting me at a golf club. Given your medical state, I would have hoped you'd choose privacy. That concern would carry more weight, I said, if you hadn't sent the courier before my discharge papers. His face shifted almost imperceptibly. The first reveal was small. Celia informed him, in a voice no louder than courtesy required, that the board was restrained from ratifying any action tied to my termination and from executing the Aizawa license until the court hearing. Not canceled. Paused. That distinction mattered because it forced them to either comply publicly or defy a court order in front of donors and reporters. The second reveal was bigger. Margaret Hartwell, who had not attended the gala in 2 years, entered from the east corridor in a dark green coat with her cane in one hand and Priya at her elbow. A ripple went through the room before anyone said a word. Margaret had seen the filings. Priya had driven to her apartment personally. Richard's widow looked at Lorraine the way people look at furniture they intend to have removed. You used my husband's foundation gala to announce a transaction you concealed from the foundation's own counsel, she said. I thought it best to hear your explanation in person. Evan tried to step into the opening and failed. Margaret, there's been a misunderstanding. Priya handed him a binder. There have been several. That was when the room began to listen. The third reveal was nuclear, and it arrived because men like Evan always believe the microphone belongs to them until someone else touches it. He moved toward the stage anyway, perhaps thinking performance could outrun paperwork. He thanked the donors, praised innovation, and began introducing the Aizawa partnership as a transformational platform moment. Then Margaret raised one hand. She did not need volume. The room quieted itself for her. Before you continue, she said, would you care to explain Northreach Holdings? If you have never seen a confident liar encounter the wrong noun in public, it is worth watching once. Evan blinked, just once. I'm not familiar with Ezra, who had positioned himself near the AV station with the sober patience of an undertaker, nodded to the technician. On the projection screen behind the podium appeared a clean excerpt from the side letter, then the beneficial ownership diagram, then the metadata summary, each page simple enough for non-lawyers to grasp. No theatrics, just sequence, date, amount, signature path. The kind of visual truth that makes denial look childish. Voices rose, not shouting. Donor voices, board voices, the worst kind because each person is still trying to sound civilized while everyone mentally recalculates allegiance. Kenji Aizawa, who had arrived quietly 10 minutes earlier and had been standing with his U.S. counsel near the rear doors, did not move until that moment. Then he stepped forward and said, in measured English, Mr. Mercer, is this why you asked months ago that all employee protections be stated in final language and not in side communications? Yes. He turned to Evan. Then we are done. There was your public set piece. Not humiliation for its own sake, clarity with witnesses. Evan tried one last move. Daniel stole confidential materials and coordinated this attack with external actors. This is extortion. Celia was ready for that. She handed the museum's event counsel a copy of Priya's affidavit, the DocuSign audit trail, and the Canary Clause explanation. He didn't leak your documents, she said. Your chair did. Also, accusing someone of extortion while standing in front of a slide showing your mother's shell entity is an interesting strategic choice. Then I waited. Security was not needed. That always disappoints people who prefer their justice cinematic. What happened instead was quieter and more devastating. 2 trustees asked Lorraine to step away from the podium area. A reporter from Cranes lowered his phone and started typing with both thumbs. A surgeon who had funded one of our fellowship programs asked, loudly enough for 3 tables to hear, whether foundation money had been exposed. Margaret turned to me and said, Daniel, stay for 5 minutes, then go home. Tomorrow will be enough. She was right. The courtroom went silent the next morning when Ezra explained the metadata chain and the judge asked Nina whether she disputed that the side letter had been attached after partial board signatures were already collected. Nina's lawyer asked for time. Judges notice that. They notice who answers quickly and who answers by rearranging paper. Celia walked the court through the canary clause, which even the judge seemed to enjoy. "So each board copy contained a distinct textual variant?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor." "And the draft used to prepare the challenge side letter matched the chair's copy?" "Yes." Lorraine's counsel objected twice and sat down worse both times. Then Priya testified. Calm, exact, no embellishment. She explained what a DocuSign audit trail was and why it mattered. She defined indemnification, escrow instructions, and beneficial ownership in plain terms because Celia had prepared her to speak like a human being rather than a law review article. The more ordinary her language, the more extraordinary the conduct sounded. By noon, the judge expanded the TRO into a preliminary injunction, froze any transfer related to the disputed escrow, ordered preservation of devices and records, and appointed an independent forensic auditor. Asset freeze sounds dramatic on television. In real life, it means you do not get to move the money while the adults figure out whether you stole it. He also referred parts of the record to state and federal regulators. That was the moment Lorraine finally looked old. Outside the courtroom, reporters clustered around the steps, but Celia cut them off with 3 sentences and a date for the next hearing. I said nothing. Silence is underrated when the documents are already speaking. Within 2 weeks, Hartwell placed Evan and Nina on leave. Lorraine resigned as board chair under the strained language people use when the alternative is being quoted under oath. The independent audit found additional side agreements tied to consulting vendors with connections to Lorraine's social circle. Aizawa terminated negotiations formally and later reopened them with a revised team under Margaret's supervision. I was reinstated first as president, then, 3 months later, I declined the chief executive role the board offered me. That surprises people when they hear the story. But by then I understood something I had not understood before: the hospital room and the black envelope and the sound of my own pulse in the quiet after midnight. Winning is not always returning to the exact chair someone tried to take from you. Sometimes winning is forcing the room to tell the truth and then deciding calmly whether you still want to live there. 1 year later, I no longer ran a public company. I chaired a smaller private medical manufacturing group in Milwaukee 4 days a week and taught a governance seminar twice a semester for executive teams who thought internal controls were something you could delegate to software. Lucy was in law school by then, which amused her more than it did me. My son Ben had stopped asking whether I planned to retire and started asking whether I planned to fish with him before one of us needed knee replacements. The house was still mine. The mortgage was lower. The lake still went gray in October, but I had learned not to confuse gray with bleak. As for the others, the consequences were legal and unglamorous, which is exactly as they should be. Evan settled civil claims, surrendered equity, and discovered that people who love disruption rarely love discovery requests. Nina cooperated, kept herself out of prison, and lost the career she had polished for 15 years. Lorraine spent the following spring pretending illness when in fact what she had was exposure. Margaret rebuilt the foundation board with the kind of boring rigor that actually saves institutions. I still have the silver USB card in my desk drawer, not as a trophy, as a reminder. Boundaries are not loud, self-worth is not a speech, and the people who try hardest to humiliate you in controlled settings are usually counting on your confusion more than your weakness. I put the phone face down more often now. Then I wait, and when I do act, I make sure the paperwork can survive the light. So tell me, have you ever watched someone mistake your silence for surrender? And if you want more stories where the receipts arrive before the apology ever does, subscribe and stay with me.